These are the phonemic systems, the phonemic vowel systems of these three languages. And I want to draw your attention particularly to the front vowels. What we can see is that in English, in the very crowded and complicated for those front vowels. Notice that in Chinese, in contrast, there are only 3 vowel height levels in the front vowels. Dutch also has a good number, about 5 front vowels, but they're arranged slightly differently along this front vowel range, differently compared to English. So then when we look at the acoustic vowel spaces of Chinese accented English and Dutch accented English, so we're looking specifically at these L1, L2 structural interactions and their impact on the acoustics now, we can see vestiges of the L1 structure in their L2 speech productions. So in particular, if you focus on the Chinese accented English, the acoustic vowel space over there, we can see that in their attempt to produce the 5 English vowel heights in the front vowels, they transpose their Chinese 3 height system onto their productions of English, giving neutralization of some of the important English contrasts. Now, what's really important about this, there are 2 things. One is that these are pairwise interactions, so these are structural interactions between the particular L1 and L2. And secondly, this is a group level feature. So this is something about Chinese accented English in general. This is not a source of systematicity at the individual talker level. It's a group level feature. Another source of structural interaction that will lead to high systematicity of L2 speech deviations comes from, again, L1, L2 interactions, but these interactions are driven by typological peculiarities of the L2. English has many of these. So for example, English is a little unusual in that it has that vowel contrast up in the high back corner of the vowel space. So this is the contrast between u and u. As you might get between the words, the name Luke and the word look. That's rather unusual. It's a typological peculiarity of English. Neither Chinese nor Dutch has this contrast. And so when we look at the acoustic vowel spaces of these languages, of speakers of these languages as they try to speak English, we find that both Chinese accented English and Dutch accented English both show a similar neutralization of that English contrast in their productions of accented English. So here are systematic features of L2 English that come from interactions between the sound structure of English and the sound structure of the native languages. But these are systematicities that will extend across L2 speakers from many different native language backgrounds. Now finally, a final source of systematicity in L2 speech production comes from features of producing second language speech that are general regardless of the L1 and L2 involved. This is just difficulties with producing a second language. And of course, the most salient of these is speaking rate. So L2 speech is always slower than L1 speech. Here are 2 illustrations of this effect. On the left, we're looking at a study of read speech. So this is L2 English as produced by native speakers, and then you can see the substantial drop in speaking rate in terms of syllables per second for a group of L2 speakers from various L1 backgrounds. The data on the right come from a different study that allows us to make 2 important points. One, you can see that this is a study that used naturalistic conversational speech. This was speech in real interactions between speakers. And this is important because it establishes that the slowed rate of L2 speech that we see in read speech is not a function of the difficulty of reading in a second language. We see this reduced rate of speech even in natural conversations. The other thing that is important about this study is that it was a very nice setup that looked at Spanish accented English as well as English accented Spanish, which allows us to see that this is not a feature of English. This is not an L2 typological peculiarity of English. This extends to other L2 as well. Okay, so what we've seen then is that L2 speech, despite being deviant, it is deviant from the L1 standard. It exhibits deviations that are highly systematic. And these systematicities derive from interactions between the L1 and the L2 that extend to groups of speakers. So we have the specific L1, L2 interactions that are specific to a particular L1, L2 pair. We have the typological peculiarities of the L2, which results in systematicities that are general across various L1s. And then we have language general L2 features that are general across any L1 and L2 involved in any interaction. So this sets up exactly the conditions that allows us to look at talker-listener alignment. These systematicities provide something to which talkers and listeners can align. They're operating in a systematically structured phonetic space. So this also leads us to understand that, in fact, L2 talkers, because of all these systematicities in their L2 speech, in fact, they share many of those systematicities, and so they're well aligned to each other. And this, of course, then makes the prediction that L2 speech should, in fact, not be all that difficult for L2 listeners to understand. This is actually a well-known phenomenon amongst L2 speakers. They often complain or often comment that it's easier to understand other L2 speakers than to understand L1 speakers. And here's one of my favorite quotes about this from one of the most famous speakers of Czech accented English. And here's what he says. There's the kind of English that Czechs speak to Spaniards and Italians speak to Russians, and here you understand 100%. American English, you get about 50%. And then there's English of which you understand nothing. So let's see if we can show this effect in the lab. So here's a setup that is quite typical in the kinds of work that we do. This is an experiment that involved presenting recorded English sentences to 4 groups of different listeners. The talkers who produced the sentences were talkers from 3 different native language backgrounds. We have Mandarin accented English, Korean accented English, and then native L1 American accented English. And these sentences are presented to listener groups that include Mandarin listeners, Korean listeners, a mixed group of non-native listeners, that is, this includes various speakers with various native language backgrounds other than Mandarin or Korean, and then native listeners, American English listeners. And the task is very simple. You just listen to the sentence, write down what you hear, and then we can score the responses and count up the numbers of words correctly recognized. So first, of course, let's have a look at what the native listeners do. And of course, the native listeners do best on the native talker. That's the green bar. They do better on the native talker than they do on either of the foreign accented speakers. But what happens when we present these foreign accented samples together with the native accented sample to these non-native listeners? So this is L2 speech going to L2 listeners. Here's what we see for the Mandarin listeners, the Koreans, and then all of the other non-natives. And what you can see right off the bat is that even though, of course, it's harder to understand second language speech than it is to understand first language speech, we've seen a disappearance of the L1 talker advantage for L2 listeners. And that's exactly what we would predict in the talker-listener alignment model, where it's all about alignment between the talker and the listener. And of course, L2 talkers are better aligned, L2 listeners are better aligned to L2 talkers than are L1 listeners. Okay, so that's what we just saw. L2 talkers are well aligned to each other. Now, what about L1 listeners? And this is where I will refer to the phonetic space that we're operating in and the process of alignment as a dynamic process. Nothing ever stays still. The alignment between listeners is something that is easily adjusted. And so let's look at it. What we're predicting then is that L1 listeners can quite easily adapt to L2 speech, provided that they have sufficient exposure to the L2 speech. And note especially that this adaptation is made possible by the systematicity of L2 speech. It's very difficult to train yourself to adapt to random variation. Systematic variation, on the other hand, you can adapt to. So we're going to look at results from a training study that involved 2 training sessions followed by a test session. Same task as in the study that I just showed you. In both training and in test, you just listen to sentences and write down what you hear. Now in the test, we present the listeners with first a set of sentences as produced by a Chinese accented talker, and then we present another set of sentences as produced by a Slovakian accented talker. During training, here's where we vary our different test conditions in a between subjects design. So we, in the end, have a total of 6 training groups, all of whom do the same thing in over 2 training sessions on 2 different days. And the training sessions differ by the talkers to whom they are exposed. So in the first test condition, we expose the talkers, they listen to sentences, different sentences from the sentences that they will hear at test. They hear sentences produced by the Chinese accented test talker himself. So here we're looking for talker-specific adaptation. Can you adapt to the specific features of that particular talker? The second training condition exposes the listeners to multiple Chinese accented talkers. So here they're hearing this Chinese accented English as produced by 5 different Chinese accented talkers, none of whom is the Chinese accented talker that they will be exposed to during test. So here we're looking for talker-independent adaptation to features of Chinese accented English, which remember are systematic because they are derived from the interactions between the L1 and the L2. And then finally, we're going to look for accent-independent adaptation, which remember we believe to be possible because of the language general features of foreign accented speech. And here we're exposing the listeners to multiple accents, so they get exposed to Chinese, Romanian, Thai, Hindi, and Korean accented English during training. And then they're tested on one of the languages, one of the accents included in the training, so Chinese accented, and then an entirely novel accent, Slovakian accented English. So here we're looking for both talker independent, it's a novel talker at test, and accent independent adaptation. And then we have a few control conditions. We have one condition where they're exposed to a single Chinese accented talker, different from the test talker. And this is to see whether the talker-independent adaptation requires exposure to multiple talkers rather than to a single talker. And then we have 2 other control conditions. One is just a task control condition where we expose the listeners to native accented English. So they just get exposure to the task, this test task, without ever getting exposed to foreign accented English at all. And then we have a group of untrained controls. So let me walk you through the results. So first, looking at the results on the first post-test, the test with the Chinese accented talker. The untrained group provides us with, in effect, a measure of the baseline intelligibility of this particular test talker. Here's how intelligible this talker's speech is if you've never been exposed to either the task or to the training with any kind of Chinese accented English. However, notice that from the control group that was just given exposure to Native American English speech, they did do better than the baseline condition in the untrained control, which just tells us that there is a benefit of this task practice. We're not particularly interested in that in this study, but we'll take this as our baseline for comparison for the other test conditions. So we're looking to see if through exposure to Chinese accented English, you can improve in your intelligibility of a novel Chinese accented talker, and the improvement should be above and beyond the improvement that you get on the task just by virtue of having practice on the task. If you're exposed to a single Chinese accented talker during training, in fact, that's not very effective for promoting talker-independent adaptation. You do no better than if you've been exposed to English speech in the first place. Exposure to the test talker himself is useful. So here, of course, we see talker-specific adaptation. You can adapt to a particular individual. But here's the really important result, which is that if exposed to multiple Chinese accented talkers, none of whom is the test talker, we find that you're just as good at the novel Chinese accented talker's speech as you are if you had been given the benefit of exposure to that talker himself. Now, importantly, we want to see if what the listeners have learned during this training is specific to Chinese accented English. Remember, they've only, in this condition, been exposed to Chinese accented English. And that's where it's important to look at the Slovakian accented test. And here we see no improvement on Slovakian accented English following training with multiple talkers of Chinese accented English. In other words, what the listeners have learned, what they have adapted to, are general features of Chinese accented English in a talker-independent way, but in an accent-specific way. So this is talker-independent, but accent-specific adaptation. They haven't just simply loosened their criteria for word recognition of foreign accented speech. They've learned something specific about the talkers, about what is general in the speech of the talkers to whom they were exposed at the group level. Now, what about the condition where we exposed the trainees to multiple accents? Here they were exposed to a variety of different accents, which supposedly would have highlighted the features of accented speech that extend beyond the members of the same native language group. And indeed, here we see that they still do better on the Chinese accented English. And notice here there was a Chinese accented talker included in the multiple accent group, and they still show improvement relative to the trained control group. They do better on the novel Chinese talker, and notice that that is still better than the condition where they were exposed to a single Chinese accented talker. So a single Chinese accented talker, when embedded in a set with other Chinese accents, can be an effective promoter of this sort of talker-listener alignment. And then, for the first time, we finally see adaptation to Slovakian accented English. So when exposed to multiple accents, when the systematic features of foreign accented speech as they extend across groups of foreign accented speakers, when listeners are given exposure to that sort of variation, they can, in fact, achieve accent-independent adaptation. And this general pattern of results has been replicated a number of times now. So let's just see where we are here. In terms of talker-listener alignment and L2 speech recognition, importantly, what we've seen is that L2 speech deviates from L1 speech in highly systematic ways. This systematicity then provides something for talkers and listeners to align to. And in fact, we find that L2 talkers are indeed quite well aligned to each other. And so we see sort of surprisingly good intelligibility of L2 speech by L2 listeners. We also see that because of this systematicity, L1 listeners are able to perceptually adapt to L2 speech. And in fact, we see highly generalized perceptual adaptation to foreign accented speech by L1 listeners. So what I've been showing you are tests of foreign accented speech recognition in very sort of disembodied, non-interactive settings. All of the tests involved recorded speech, very neutral sentences, completely taken out of context, presented to listeners. In the last few minutes of this talk, what I want to do is show you how talker-listener alignment also has an impact on communicative efficiency in a broader sense when interaction actually occurs. So to do this, we ran an experiment using a conversation elicitation technique that involves the diapix task. So this is a dialogue-based picture matching task that involves two participants. So you have two talkers. Each one has a picture. Each talker cannot see the other person's picture. And the task is simply to work together to find 10 differences that exist between the two pictures. Now, this is a very flexible task, and there are many ways that this can be implemented. In our implementation, we wanted to get lots of opportunities for interaction and alignment between the two participants. So we implemented this in the following way. There are some differences that involve an element that is present in picture A, but absent from picture B. There are other elements that are present in picture B, but absent from picture A. And then finally, there are some elements that just involve a difference between the two pictures. This is a difference in the color of the woman's shoes. So in this way, we get a very balanced amount of speech between the two talkers, and they are doing this while talking through the task. And then what we can do as a measure of communicative efficiency is just look at how long does it take them to complete this task. Everybody does complete the task with great success, but it can vary in the amount of time that it takes. And we can look at this in 4 different types of pairs that differ with respect to the alignment between the participants. So first we have 2 speakers who are well aligned to each other, 2 native speakers of the target language, so they're well aligned to each other and to the language of the interaction. Then we have an L1 and an L2 talker. So here they're not aligned to each other, and one of them is not aligned to the language of the task. And then we have 2 non-native speakers from the same native language background and 2 native speakers from different native language backgrounds. So you can see we're decreasing the alignment between the talkers with respect to each other, as well as with respect to the target language. Of course, the native speaker pairs are the most efficient. They finish this task in the shortest amount of time. When you add a non-native speaker into the pair, the time to complete the task goes up significantly. But notice that when you have 2 non-native speakers from the same native language background, they're just as efficient as a native and a non-native speaker. And remember that the native speaker here is aligned to the task of the language, even if they're not aligned within the pair. When you get 2 non-native speakers from different native language backgrounds, that's the most difficult situation. And here we have the least communicative efficiency and the longest time to complete the task. Okay, so just to sum up here, we have these systematic L2 speech deviations that allow for different patterns of talker-listener alignment, and we find that speech intelligibility, recognition accuracy, as well as communicative efficiency in interactive tasks seems to be quite closely tied to alignment in this very systematic phonetic space. So my final thought for you to leave you with today is just to remind us all that L2 speech communication, like all speech communication, is always a cooperative activity in which interlocutors are constantly adjusting their speech perception and their production, although I didn't talk about production today, according to the communicative conditions. It's not just a matter of how deviant a particular signal is. That deviance is only relevant in a particular context. Thank you. I just will end to acknowledge that all of this work, of course, was carried out with constant and deep collaboration with a fantastic group of postdocs and students and various other collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for a fantastic survey talk. We have time for questions.
Thank you so much for the fabulous talk. I have a question about the accent-independent adaptation. I'm curious, so you said for the talker-independent adaptation to, for example, Chinese accented English, you said the mechanism is really generalizing and it's not just relaxing the criteria. But what do you think the mechanism for the accent-independent adaptation is?
Yeah.
Is that relaxation of the criteria? What do you think? What do you hypothesize the mechanism is there? Thank you.
So we don't have any direct evidence that it's not just a general relaxing of the, just broad criteria relaxation in that particular case. We have the evidence from the other case. But so that's still a little bit of an open question. The mechanism that would underlie this, however, is exactly the, let's see if we can go back, sources of systematicity that extend beyond one group of accented speakers. So the sources of systematicity that come from the L2 typological peculiarities. So many languages will approach English in the same way simply because English is a little bit odd and it presents the same problem to speakers from different native language backgrounds. And also because of the language general L2 features, which are independent of the particular L1 or L2, or independent of whatever languages are involved. So that does provide systematicity in foreign accented speech in general, in foreign accented English in general, that the listeners could be using to to drive this perceptual adaptation. That's the idea.
Otis.
Thank you, that was very interesting. I have a question about your last experiment, the diapics task. So in the previous experiments that you talked about, you can sort of control for the level of the accent, so the strength of the accent, but in the diapics task, that's probably a bit more difficult than pronunciation how good you are in the language will probably play a role as well. So can you say something about that?
You mean proficiency in the L2 more broadly construed than just in terms of their phonetics?
Both. So both proficiency, because if you don't know the word or if you have trouble building up the sentences, that will impair the communication, and also the level of accent.
Yeah, I mean, so let's see, what can I say about that? Well, first of all, these are averages over groups. So there is quite a bit of, then you could see, I mean, there was a lot of variation. The speakers they do vary in their proficiency, they do vary in their vocabulary a lot, and so some of them find the task quite a bit easier to perform than others. They never, so when we look at that was just one measure, the time to complete the task. There are other ways that we can look at communicative efficiency that might reveal finer grained differences between the individual talkers and the different groups. So for example, we have also looked at word type to token ratio. So that's a measure of efficiency. You know, how many times do you need to repeat a particular word to get the meaning across? And we find sort of a similar pattern. I can actually show you that data, although I think we're running out of time, so I won't do that. But as you go across the groups and the decrease in talker-listener alignment, we find a decrease in the efficiency of the type-to-token ratio of the individual words that they use. So you see these measures of communicative efficiency across all measures of linguistic performance. I mean, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but...
Partially, yeah.
Okay.
So, because it's clear there's quite a range of proficiency, and so I'm wondering whether it's possible to do like a post hoc analysis of the degree of accentedness or proficiency or whatever, and see whether that correlates whether it correlates between the groups and with the performance measure that you've used.
Yeah, actually, so let me just say one thing about proficiency of these particular talkers. They're all at about a similar level of proficiency. They're all incoming graduate students to Northwestern University. So, I mean, there is a range in there, but then it's not a huge range. The biggest range is, the range that you were seeing was, of course, in time to complete the task with their pair. Yeah, so that's just a comment about the proficiency, yeah.
Okay, I think we have to stop here. I would like to give the floor to one of the organizers.
Well, thank you very much again for a really wonderful talk. Thanks from the Interspeech Organizing Committee and from an L2 speaker of English. So thank you very much and congratulations. And I hope this is a small memory to this wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
So microphone is over there. So yeah, so the survey talk will be given by Florian Metze from Carnegie Mellon University. Title is the Multi-Modal Processing of Speech and Language. So please welcome Florian.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for having me. I'm excited to be giving a keynote, or not so keynote, it's a survey talk on multimodal processing of speech and language. I did upload my slides. And, oh yeah. Here is, and here we are, good. So what I want to talk about today is I'll span a broader arc about what does multimodality mean, what does multimodality mean for humans, and how can we use this for speech recognition. Multimodality is natural for humans. I know it's a cliche, but I think it's really true. So it's really appropriate to view speech processing for machines as a multimodal problem as well. So I'm going to sort of categorize multimodality for speech processing a little bit, give a little bit of a history, and talk about some selected works that I think are really exciting and that are going to bring the field forward. Multimodality is hardly new, but I think what's really new and what's making a difference over the last couple of years is sort of the simplicity and the feasibility of data collection and processing on a large scale. So we have a lot more opportunities for collecting data, processing data that we didn't have in the past. If you think about found materials, for example, how-to videos, tutorials, or new modalities that we get with new sensors that allow us to process data in new ways or process new data in ways that weren't possible just a few years ago. So what we really should be doing, and what I'll try to do with this talk, is sort of expand the horizon to new tasks a little bit. What I'll sort of structure the talk around is really viewing multimodality from three perspectives, sort of a more traditional perspective to say, can we use multimodality to correct errors in a system, to use redundancy in a system, and sort of work from modalities under the assumption that individual modalities are a little bit weak and error prone. So if we have noise, can we compensate for noise and recover information from different modalities if it's missing in one of the individual modalities? The next thing that I'll sort of talk about is maybe a little bit a perspective that's not so much focused on the system, but it's focused on the human, to say, if we have multiple views of the same data, can we use multimodality to ground the data and to expand our context? And I think where we are now with the technology, single modalities are much, much better than they were just a short time ago. And so what we want to do is identify references to the same information in different modalities and remove those to improve our modeling of context. Finally, the third perspective that I want to take is to say, can we look at multimodality from an artificial intelligence perspective and exploit multimodality for self-training or unsupervised training? Because going forward, label scarcity is going to be the big problem. We have large amounts of data, but we hardly ever have good labels to train and do sort of traditional supervised training on it. So what we want to do is bootstrap systems with limited or no supervision. So system-level multimodality is first. Humans use visual cues when beneficial, so it seems natural that machines should do this as well. The obvious use case for this is really visual speech. And we know that visual speech provides phonetic and temporal cues that aid the perception of speech and is particularly beneficial to communication in noisy environments. There's been, can I show? Yeah. Okay. There's been studies, the masking of speech in particular, that show how humans tend to focus their attention on lips in noisy environments and how this helps improve the intelligibility of speech in noisy environments, both for clear speech in the study from 2019 or vocoded speech. And we're sort of getting a benefit in that we can express in sort of decibel to say how much more intelligible is speech for a human when we have lip information versus when we don't have lip information. There is, of course, things like the McGurk effect, when we can fool our multimodal perception, in particular in noisy environments. So if a person hears the sound to my bab, poop me, poop brive, and we overlay the image for a person saying, the video for a person saying, my gag, cook me, cook drive, the person, a listener or a seer, perceives this as my dot taught me to drive. That's the famous hearing lips and seeing voices paper. Now this has all been known for a long time, and it's sort of been the poster child for, it's become the poster child for audiovisual speech recognition. Starting in 1984, people have tried to use or have used lip reading to enhance speech recognition. In 1989, the first study really integrated acoustic and visual speech signals using neural networks, and it also created this system diagram that I think we can still use today, about, 30 years later, to describe most of the work on lip reading. Which is still useful and still not solved, but what I want to do is really say we can do more with multimodal processing, and we should look at more features and look at more models to, more tasks to apply our tools and techniques to. One of the very recent works in the same spirit is also large-scale visual speech recognition, where the idea is really take a system that can do lip reading and can do lip reading only. And so the most recent systems here work on about 3,900 hours of video, applies an ASR pipeline to video features, and gets a word error rate of about 40% just by training on lip reading without any acoustic information at all. However, this particular system, of course, it was built by Google, trains for about 1 month on 64 GPUs, so it's not something that's easily reproducible for most of us, unfortunately. But the availability of large data really allows us to do things that weren't possible before. So this being said, we should really look beyond speech to text and say, well, if we have multimodal information, what else can we do? Can we not just improve speech to text systems, but can we also improve interactive systems? What could multimodal information fusion look like here? And so that's sort of the famous multimodal interaction paradigm, where we have a user, and the user produces speech, we perform speech recognition, but the user may also do something else. He might point to a map, and so we perform gesture recognition, and we do then spoken language interpretation, gesture language interpretation, and we multimodally fuse this, both of these information streams, do some filtering, and pass this information onto an application. And I think as we're going beyond just speech to text, but speech to meaning, speech to interaction, even early work in the 2000s or even before that in multimodal interaction can give us a lot of inspiration about what tasks to pursue, what to do, and how to improve systems that don't just translate speech to text, that work together with humans. Famous examples here are already put that there when we have redundant input and we're performing syntactic and semantic analysis. And if we have failures, then we make them more obvious through the use of this multimodal interaction paradigm. We try and detect failures more early in the process and make the interaction more seamless with the user. If app errors happen, we can use multimodality to sort of perform error correction. And this can happen at several levels. Honest system errors, if, for example, we have a system that, where we have a person that says, give me a new display. A system might recognize this as give me a new display, or 30 and 13 may often be confused, and multimodal interaction is often a good modality or a good way of correcting these errors. So we can either choose from a list, we can re-speak things, which takes time, but we could also perform handwriting, spelling, or typing. And even in 2001, it was shown that these additional modalities can correct errors with a great accuracy and with very little effort by the user. Any discussion of multimodality wouldn't be complete without pointing to the 10 myths of multimodal interaction that Sharon Oviatt formulated. Really, whatever we do with multiple modalities, I think we need to take a step back and remember them and say, well, which one of those applies to whatever multimodal work we're still doing now? So in multimodal interaction, it was really to say, well, if you build a multimodal system, users will interact multimodally. And Sharon Oviatt could show that that's not always the case. So you really want to make sure that if you have multimodal data, you can, you should always take a step back and say, do we really need it? Are we really making a difference? In multimodal interaction, the question really was, or the assumption was that multimodal input involves simultaneous signal, and it turns out that this is not always the case, so we should keep this in mind too. And also, importantly, multimodal language does not differ linguistically from unimodal language. So if we are in a multimodal setting, language, speech will be different from the same sort of the speech patterns that we would see if we were in a unimodal setting. So we need to keep those myths in mind, and I find it refreshing to look at them. I only want to point out a few here, but I find it good to look at them and see how this applies to multimodal speech recognition or some of the other tasks that I'll be talking about. So this being said, so far we've been using multimodality to sort of correct system errors. So what I want to talk about now is how can we take this a step further, and what do we need to improve on this? And I want to argue that if we want to improve on correcting system errors through redundancy, what we want to do is we need to determine which of those things, and we need to learn automatically which of those elements that we can use in the individual modalities can match across different modalities. So if we have an object in speech, how does it correspond to an object in touch? Or if we have an object in speech, how does it correspond to an object that I'm seeing in an image or a video? And we want to learn these correspondences from data, and this is what a lot of the current work in multimodal processing of speech is about. In the 80s, when we had to put the dare case, we could hand code these things, but this is clearly something that, that doesn't scale. So what we want to work on is, can we figure out automatically what objects in different modalities match to each other? Can we learn how to combine cues from multiple modalities? And can we fuse very different types of information from different modalities? What we need to do is learn shared representation from different modalities and not just fuse features, states, or decisions. A nice paper that I saw that sort of started a lot of other work is multimodal representation learning from Andrew Ng and the team working with him, where they really took a first step towards grounding to learn shared representations between acoustics and images or video features when they took spoken representations of the MNIST database, so spoken images and images of handwritten images of numbers, and built autoencoders, either a video-only deep autoencoder that takes video as an image as an input and produces a video reconstruction and also an audio reconstruction, which you can see on the left-hand side, or they built a bimodal deep autoencoder that takes audio input and video input, creates a shared representation between those two, and learns to reproduce audio and video. The extra value of this is, sorry, this was on Quavi, this was not on MNIST. The benefit of this is immediately that if you have a baseline system that just uses traditional video features, we're getting a classification accuracy of about 58% on the first line. If we use a deep learning system, we get about 65%. And if we use this autoencoder that takes video features as an input and learns a representation from which audio and images can be reproduced, we're getting an accuracy of 68%, which is the highest accuracy for this video speech classification task that they were able to achieve here. And in this particular example, this video-only deep autoencoder also beats the performance of the bimodal deep autoencoder that has an accuracy of about 66% rather than 66%. But even the bimodal system that learns a shared representation between audio and video improves on the baseline. What else can we do with this setup? Well, we are of course also interested in audiovisual speech classification or audio-only speech classification, and we can see if we do sort of the work that we are as speech researchers are familiar with. We are performing audio and vision fusion, that's in the line C here, and we see that it improves a little bit in the noisy condition. We get a performance of 77% for classification of noisy audio with a bimodal deep audio encoder over a baseline performance of 75%. We are not improving over the audio-only performance in the clean case, but if we're performing bimodal fusion of the bimodal features with audio-only features. So we're taking an audio-only representation and we're fusing the audio-only representation with an audio-visual representation and build a classifier on top of this. This is line D. We're getting an improvement in accuracy for noisy audio that's significantly higher than the only bimodal representation. So what this shows is that a system that has learned from audio and video input and learned a shared representation from audio and video input provides complementary information to a system that only learned from the audio information. And so this extra information can be used to improve the accuracy for the classification of noisy audio. So even in the for audio-visual speech classification or for only audio classification, when we classify systems, there's additional information that can be learned and that can be more robust to noise that can be learned from audio-visual information. Now, knowing this, what would we be looking at today? In the last few years, there's been a lot of work, particularly in the natural language processing community, about things like embeddings, and really they're nothing else than distributed representations of information that we can see, that we can view very similarly to those compressed representations that we learned on this audiovisual task. So really, since 2017 or so, 2017 could, I think, be called the year of the embedding, and you know that you can turn anything into a vector, and maybe Ray Mooney doesn't believe it, and I'm not sure if you can really say it, but a lot of information can be compressed into a single vector, and using embeddings, we can compute similarities between objects, much like doing the embedding for king minus the embedding for a man plus the embedding for a woman becomes the embedding for queen. So it's a very semantic and a very rich representation that we want to use maybe also for speech recognition. Early work, Mikhailov and colleagues, early work used the neural network language models to compute embeddings for words. That's Benjo and colleagues. And in 2013, that work really took off, and Mikhailov and colleagues came up with an efficient way of computing word representations in vector space. Can we do the same thing for speech? And it turns out we can. There's many different ways. The first way that I could really find is work by Benjo and Heigold, when they took a system where they extracted short pieces of audio, trained a word-based classifier on these short pieces of audio to create an embedding, which is really just the activations at the penultimate layer before the softmax layer, and then took the corresponding words and learned a triplet ranking loss towards those embeddings. So you train a system to classify words based on audio, and you train using a triplet ranking loss, you train other systems to reproduce those representations using not audio as input, but using letter n-grams that you derive from the characters as an input. And by training the system so that the embedding of the correct word has a closer distance than the embedding of a wrong word, you can train those systems for speech and for text. And so similar embedding gets created for text and audio representations, which mean you can also use them for speech recognition. In this particular case, it didn't help, but it's cool, I think, because we can view audio and text as two modalities, and we can see what's happening and which words get similar representations in the audio. So in this case, words like heart, hearts, I heart, heart, hearted, art, get similar representations at the output of the audio neural network, and things like please, please, please also get similar representations at the output of the neural network. So we can see that we are creating a neural network that gives us an embedding, an audio embedding for words where things that sound similar are similar. And all we need is sort of the transcriptions, the word string, to create those models. So what else can we do with this? Can we take it a step further? And can we maybe perform ASR with this using not just purely acoustic features as an input, but can we use ASR that performs speech recognition with maybe semantic embeddings, where we're taking the embeddings not from text, but where we're taking the embeddings from images or videos that are associated with the audio that we're trying to recognize. That's something that we've tried. So if we have videos, we can extract images from those videos and using techniques like ImageNet. And so if I have a video where, for example, I see a mushroom, I can create an output that says here mushroom, and I get this at the output layer, but at the same time, I can take the penultimate layer, what's called the fully connected layer, and I can compute the PCA on this, and I can treat this as an embedding, a semantic compact representation of the contents of the images. And if the content of this image is related to the content of the spoken channel, I can probably use this to adapt the speech recognizer much as I can use an I-vector. So I want to make the distinction here between audiovisual ASR, which is sort of lip reading, and multimodal ASR, where we're extracting information from the image in maybe a semantic space and use this to adapt the recognizer. So we can adapt a speech recognizer on objects that I see in an image rather than lips that move in sync with the audio. Now this will of course only work when, in the example of this open domain video here, the person will talk about an airplane or will talk about how to fly, because the semantic information is something that I can use to either adapt the language model of a speech recognizer, bias it towards airplanes, or I can use it to adapt the acoustic model, biasing towards being outside and being maybe having wind noises in the background. We collected a data set for doing these types of experiments. We collected 2,000 hours of how-to videos where we had ground truth captions, where we had part of it also translated into Portuguese. And we collect metadata like number of likes and even summaries for those videos. So for every 90-second long video, we have a short sentence that describes what this video is about. You can find it and download it. And now what we want to do is take the audio in these systems and see if we can adapt the recognizer, not just based on acoustic properties, but based on information, semantic information that we extract from the images. Now, adaptation of a recognizer usually uses I-vectors, so we can extract I-vectors and we can view an I-vector as a 100-dimensional representation that we use as an embedding and to adapt a certain utterance. But we can also extract a keyframe from the video that corresponds to the segment, convert it into a 100-dimensional representation, and use it to train a neural network using standard techniques that we also use for adapting a recognizer with I-vectors. So we did this. We built a relatively simple DNN baseline. It gives us a word error rate of 23.4%. And we adapt this baseline with 100-dimensional speaker I-vectors. We're getting an improvement down to 22.0% and 6.0 relative percent improvement. And if we run the same method and we adapt a 161-dimensional visual feature vector, where the input doesn't come from the audio, but it comes from the images and the objects that we detect in the image, we're getting a word error rate of 22.3%, which is still in about a 5% relative improvement. Not quite as much as we're getting with an I-vector, but still in the same ballpark. If we combine both of those features, we're getting a performance of 21.5%, an 8% relative improvement. So those two representations aren't completely orthogonal, but they do give us additional information that helps improve speech recognition. This was adaptation of the language model. And you would expect if we have acoustic information or if we have semantic information from the image, we should also be able to adapt the language model. And language model adaptation is relatively straightforward. If we have a neural network language model, we can provide this embedding vector as an additional input in, say, the word embeddings that we learn or that we pass through in the context vector. And so we can train a neural network language model which we did in this case, even though we have relatively long sentences, about 18 words. So what we got now is our baseline, 23.4%. Acoustic model adaptation gives us 22.3%. Language model adaptation, it turns out, gives us 22.6%. So again, not quite as much as the language model adaptation gives us, but a significant improvement over the the baseline, and combining the acoustic model adaptation and the language model adaptation gives us 21.5% using language model rescoring in this case. We ran a couple of additional experiments using CTC, or we also documented the improvement in the perplexity of the language model, which in this case goes from 89% down to 74%. So that's nice, but really, if we're saying we're adapting with semantic features and cross-modal features, what we should really want to do is understand why does it help and how does it help. So we have a test set of 156 videos, and we look at it and we found out that out of these 156 videos in the test set, using language model adaptation, 126 improve. So almost all the videos in the test set improve. And it sort of makes sense if you're saying, well, we adapt to the domain of the data. If we have videos that show you how to fly, and I'm adapting the language model, that should help. If I have videos that show you how to cook, and I'm adapting the language model, that should help. If we look at the acoustic model adaptation really, it turns out, improves 55 out of the 156 videos in the test set. And if we did an analysis, we looked at those, and it turns out that most of those videos are outdoor videos and acoustically challenging videos. So even though overall we're getting a bigger improvement out of adapting the acoustic model, we're getting improvements for the challenging, the hard videos, and we're getting a big improvement for the hard videos. So it really also makes sense to say acoustic model adaptation really only helps for the hard videos and not across the board. We took this idea and we took it to Johns Hopkins University for the Jelinek Memorial Workshop, in this case the 2018 edition, where we said, well, what else can we do? Can we go beyond this and use sequence-to-sequence models, a unified architecture to do automatic speech recognition, machine translation, or even speech translation, or video summarization, using those features, the audio, the text, in a unified architecture. So we have this big picture here, and you can say we can go from text to text in a different language, we can go from speech to text, or from speech to text in a different language, using the same architecture and using this idea of multimodal speech recognition or multimodal machine translation. It turns out the machine translation community had discovered the same idea, and they had also already run evaluations on the multi-30K data set, where they could show that multimodal machine translation systems that take text and an associated image also improve about monomodal machine translation systems. I don't want to talk about the speech recognition experiments or the machine translation experiments here, but I want to show what else we did, which is really video summarization. On this data set that we collected, we also have short sentences, or 3 sentences that give us a short summary of a video to say, this video shows you how to ride a bike, it teaches you how to keep your balance and how not to fall. And the input so now is 90 seconds of video and associated images, and the output is a short summary that we can generate. And what we were able to show is that using this end-to-end architecture that inputs images, text, and audio, we can generate these summaries better when we have multimodal input than when we only have the text input or when we only have the images as an input. So the white numbers essentially are baselines using rules or just language model sampling, and the yellow systems are text-only input or visual-only input, and the multimodal results on the yellow background improve, again, statistically significant on all the unimodal systems that were generated using sequence-to-sequence models, but also on all the other baselines that we were able to implement that did not try sequence-to-sequence models. So the message really here is multimodality using text or speech and images improves on monomodal baselines for both speech recognition, machine translation, and video summarization, where video summarization means video to text. We did some more analysis on this and looked at the features that we're extracting, and when we're generating the summaries, where are we paying attention to? So we have a system using hierarchical attention, and so we can see when the model generates certain words, which parts of the input text is it paying attention to, which part of the input images is it paying attention to, and it turns out that the model really is paying attention to those parts of the input video where it sees actions that are related to the subject of the video. So in this example here, on the beginning of the video, it's a lot of talking and preparing the brush, so there's very little movement in the image part, so the model doesn't pay attention to this. In the middle of the video, there is actually a close-up of a person performing brush strokes with a hand, and when the system generates the output, it says you learn how to brush on the water or brush on the paper. Then it actually pays attention to the part in the image and the part in the video where the brush stroking action is being shown. And again, at the end, there is sort of a close-up of brush strokes, but you don't see a hand. And so it doesn't pay attention to this when it's talking about learning how to make your brush strokes with a hand. We have a few examples of the text that we generate for this video summarization because we were surprised how well it works, and sort of these rouge scores and content of one scores don't really tell you a lot. So our systems are able to generate video summaries that say things like, learn the basics of Hatha Yoga with expert tips on headache relief in this free home improvement video. So they're not correct, they're not always correct, but they sound like good sentences, and we hope that with more data we're able to improve these things. This was an example of a system with only 25 content of one, systems with 47 content of one sound even a bit better. All right, so this is sort of ongoing work. What we're doing here is we're learning joint representations between multiple modalities. We are not trying to correct errors in individual modalities specifically, but we're analyzing how to map content from different modalities together and improve it, help use it to improve speech recognition, translation, or summarization. Now, if we want to take it a step further still, what do we want to do, or what do we need to do to improve those systems and make them more practical? Well, I think really what we need to do is take it towards some self or unsupervised training, because all these systems so far relied on lots of labeled training data, and we live in an age where we do have lots of unlabeled training data and want to make use of it. So a lot of exciting multimodal work these days, I think, is going on in the field of unsupervised learning of spoken language with visual context. So here's an example of a work that comes out of Jim Glass's group, where we also take images. You can see this on the left-hand side. We're extracting semantic features using a pre-trained VGG net, which we don't use for classification, but again, just for extracting a semantic representation of this image. And we have a corresponding audio caption. So people spoke a sentence that describes this image, and we're using an image caption similarity score to train a system where we're trying to make the audio network learn a representation that resembles the video representation. But we're learning this not from text, but we're learning this from audio that's associated with this image. And there's also work that shows that sight and sound converge to form modality invariant representations in the brain. So this is sort of a similar process happening in the brain. The interesting thing in these experiments here is that we can find that the system, if we analyze it a little bit more, we see that the audio caption or the audio system learns to pay attention, again looking at the activations here, at the parts where in the upper image we talk about grassy and field or large, and those are sort of properties of the image. Or in the lower example, you can see that this system learns to pay attention, although it's not an attention-based model, on a baseball player, so it puts weight on the part of the audio when the audio says baseball player. but it doesn't put a lot of weight on the part of the audio where it's only said baseball. So clearly this model learns and it figures out automatically that in the image, a baseball player is an important property because it puts weight on that part of the audio where baseball player is being spoken and not so much on baseball. So what could this be used for? Well, the model learns to recognize semantically meaningful words or phrases at the spectral level without transcriptions. So we can use this for spoken image search, we could use this for jointly learning or annotating objects and words, we could use information retrieval, multilingual spoken dictionaries for unknown languages, speech recognition or translation without transcriptions, lots of ideas, I think. There is more work that's going on in the same direction that says, can we learn correspondences even between sounds and images on large amounts of video? So we're not necessarily restricted to speech, but we're also learning correspondences between sounds, non-speech sounds, and objects in the images, and we are able to do things like sound localization, action recognition, or on and off-screen audio separation. So using visual information, we're able to recognize which part of the audio comes from the speaker that's visible on the screen and moves the lips, and we can separate out off-screen audio that does not correspond to something that's visible in the image. And all these things are sort of learned without labels. So I think clearly lip reading is making a comeback. It is the showcase for multimodality in speech. And despite years of work, it's still hard to get it right. But what I would sort of encourage all of us to do is really look at lots of data and try and figure out audiovisual correspondences to provide weak supervision of some kind to learn from the large amounts of multimodal data that are available without requiring supervised training data, because I think that's a lot of very exciting research that we'll be able to do now or in the near future. So in case you were wondering why I put up this image, it's the grounding that's new and it's the grounding that's important. So thank you very much, and I want to acknowledge the JSOL 2018 team that did a lot of the experiments that I showed in this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, that's a great talk. Thank you. So, okay, so we're going to take one question.
Hi, Domis. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very nice. So I have a question about the current research on specifically for the audiovisual ASR. Recently, we actually saw a lot of a nice framework from the audio-only ASR community. So I also see a lot of people that they are trying to introduce more subnet as branch into, for example, for the large model, so that they say, okay, we have nice ASR, actually audiovisual ASR framework, but actually, to me, it's, personal opinion, it's a little bit simple, because especially for the presentation you have here for the multimodal deep learning paper, they also mentioned that if you just simply concatenate the audio and the visual feature together, actually it will not work in the clean session. So definitely, there must be some fusion mechanism between them. So I think, or don't you think actually we should concentrate more on the fusion strategy for the multimodal deep learning?
Yes, I did not speak about the models at all and the models that we developed during the workshop, and partly that was on purpose. If you look at the Google Deep Context paper, for example, it shows amazing gains for speech recognition when you're fusing textual context to produce textual output. And we are running a couple of experiments right now to see what happens if we encode this textual context into an embedding first and then try and integrate it into the model, how to best do this, or if it's best to generate text from an embedding and then use the deep context architecture or something. It's a huge space to explore, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. I agree.
Okay, so unfortunately, time is run out. So let's thank Florian again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Of course, this is, again, one of the fantastic and inspiring survey talks at Interspeech, and on behalf of the organizing committee, we want to give you a small reminder of your talk. And thank you very much for having this talk. And with all this work, we hope that there will be a special issue, a paper in the journal that is coming up. Thank you very much. Thanks to Florian.